Kyrie eleison.
Hello, and welcome to episode number 3 of the Catholic Workers Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be discussing housing, and more specifically, public housing. The Catholic Church, in her corporal works of mercy, calls us to shelter the homeless. This imperative stems from Isaiah chapter 58, where God is talking about what kind of fast pleases him. Specifically, in verse 7, he says, "Is it not sharing your food with the hungry and sheltering the homeless poor?" Much like in last episode when we were discussing the corporal works of mercy, in this episode I want to talk about what it would mean for our faith if we practice this not just as individuals, but as a society. In the modern world we live in, with the wealthiest society in human history, how would it be possible to carry out this imperative? So, with that in mind, what would be the most effective way to carry this out? In their 2022 book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem, Clayton Page Aldern and Greg Colburn convincingly argue that rates of homelessness are related to absolute rent levels and rental vacancy. What this means is that the more absolute rent levels increase, the more homelessness will increase. And the more rental vacancies decrease, the more homelessness will increase as well. Their findings indicate that for every $1,000 increase in rent, we would expect a 0.4% increase in the homelessness rate. So by decreasing absolute rent levels, we can reduce levels of homelessness. So what's the best way to go about reducing absolute rent levels? Well, fundamental economics tells us that as we raise the supply of something, the price of that good should go down if everything else remains equal. Housing has a pretty constant demand to it, considering the fact that everybody needs it in some kind of, at least some minimal form. So increasing the supply of housing would help us to reduce the price. So how can we increase the supply of housing? Well, there are a few ways of doing that. To start off with, and one of the most common ways here in the United States that we choose to do that, is by encouraging private sector housing development. What this does is that it encourages private developers to build more housing. There are a few ways that we and the government could help, or we or the government could help ease some of these burdens to increase the amount of private sector construction. One of the ways to do that is by reducing regulatory burden. So this can be by minimizing delays spent on acquiring permits and adhering. The longer a project takes, the more delays that there are, the higher the costs are going to be because developers have to continue to carry those costs of the land by paying the taxes and any upkeep that's necessary, as well as keeping anybody else on retainer that they might have to then hire to navigate these permit and hearing. Another way to reduce costs is by changing zoning laws. So currently, many American cities have zoning. In fact, most, besides the major city that I live in, Houston, have zoning. And what this does is that it prevents certain housing or certain kinds of structures from being built in certain areas. Now, this doesn't necessarily cover nuisance laws, so it doesn't necessarily cover anything like excess noise, excess, foul odors coming from property, or any kind of pollution that comes from a property. It really mainly deals with what kind of residential housing or what kind of commercial, or if only one type of housing, like, or one type of, either residential or commercial is allowed in a specific area. And what this does is that it artificially restricts the supply of housing that's allowed. So most American cities are zoned only for single-family homes, and this severely limits the amount of housing that can be built if there are minimum lot sizes. So, for example, a house can't be smaller than a certain size, and a lot can't be smaller than a certain size, is going to dictate how much housing is going to be able to be built in an area. Moreover, this makes certain developments unaffordable if they aren't able to build to the density that land values might require them to build. Another burden for private developers that increase costs are parking requirements. So parking requirements can increase costs in two different ways. The first is that it simply costs more money if you're required to build something. So building a parking garage will take more money than if they didn't have to build it. But another way that it increased costs is through the opportunity cost of building parking. So if you're building parking on land or in an area, you're necessarily not building something else. So those parking spaces or those parking garages could be additional housing units that could then um, make the project more viable. One final way that determines the uh, cost or affordability of developing real estate in an area is the cost of labor and materials in the local market. Now, currently in the US, the federal government subsidizes private developers to build low income housing. And this is through a program created by Congress in 1986 called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit, or LIHTC. This program was created by Congress but is administered by state and local agencies. And it essentially gives developers $10 billion in tax breaks a year to build housing that has to meet certain affordability requirements. These affordability requirements are set by the localities that are handing out the LIHTC money, and it can be usually for a few decades, around 35 to 50 years. It can be in perpetuity, but usually a certain number of the units have to be set aside and designated as affordable housing. Now, the problem with this, first of all, is that it subsidizes private profits, so it's a less efficient way of trying to increase the supply of housing because it's going to necessarily subsidize the profits of private developers. But moreover, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem if when these affordable units are transitioned back into market rate units, if enough housing hasn't been built, then the price is just simply going to return to the market level. And we're going to be back in the same unaffordable situation that we were in before. So, one way to eliminate homelessness, outside of just decreasing these rent levels, is called the housing first model. So, in the housing first model, homeless people are given housing without having to solve other problems first. So, other programs, and these kinds are typically seen in the US, are where a homeless person has to prove that they've gone through mental health or drug counseling before they're able to um, apply for an affordable housing unit. In the housing first systems, the idea is to give a homeless person housing, and that it then gives them the stability to solve some of these other problems in their life. And the data in multiple studies shows that these housing first systems are the most effective at reducing homelessness rate. So one study showed that these permanent housing solutions, as long as the housing is permanent in these housing first solutions, can have housing retention rates of up to 98% over the course of a year. Um, and the upside to this as well is not just that it reduces homelessness and could potentially eliminate it, but it also saves money for locality. So instead of providing homeless people with a place to live, currently they often use a lot of emergency services. And this can cost localities money. So by providing them a place to live, it reduces the burden on emergency services. And one study showed that this can save about $31,000 a year, $31,000 over the course of 2 years, with another study showing savings of $23,000 a year per person compared to a traditional shelter program. So what this means is that even including some of the costs of your traditional shelter program, there are still massive savings to localities by simply providing the need that exists in the first place. So how many people might benefit from a solution like this? So it's important to start local and to solve problems locally so that we can work up to a larger solution, and especially so that we can try things out and see if they work and experiment to see what the best system is. So the city that I live in is Houston, Texas, and Houston actually already practices a housing first approach. and they've seen some pretty good results. So through the program since 2011, homelessness has decreased by 63%. Um, but the problem is that this isn't continuing on to the current day. Actually, housing costs have been increasing and wages have been stagnating in the Houston metro area. And the number of homeless people have actually been increasing in the past few years. At any given moment, there are around 3,200 people experiencing homelessness in the Houston region. But it's not just homeless people that struggle with housing and struggle with affordable housing. In fact, Houston, despite having a reputation for being very affordable, is becoming increasingly unaffordable in terms of housing. So, according to a study, a report put out by the Kinder Institute for Urban Research in 2023, a majority of renters in Houston and Harris County are classified as cost burden. What this means is that they're spending over 30% of their income on housing. So, with about 2.3 million people in the city of Houston, about 60% of households being renters, this gives us about 700,000 rent cost burden people in the city of Houston. Coupled with this fact, evictions are at an all-time high of 80,000, even as 20% of the housing in Houston and Harris County are graded as below average. What this means is that people are struggling to pay rent for worse accommodations. So what might be the most effective way to reduce housing costs? So the most effective way to reduce housing costs is simply to build housing. But to answer how much it might cost to build housing, we need to know the value of a few variables. So one of the first ones is the average square feet of living space needed per person, the cost of building per square foot, and the interest rate. So for a rough estimate, we're going to assume that the minimum space needed per person is around 600 square feet, that the average cost to build an apartment is going to be around $350 per square foot, and multiplying these together gives us the cost to build a unit of housing for one person at $210,000. Now, considering the number of homeless people that I quoted above previously and the number of cost burden renters in the city of Houston, it would cost $687 million to build a unit for each homeless person and $147 billion to build a unit for every cost burden renter. So at current interest rates, the city of Houston is able to borrow at around 3.8%. So with a 30-year mortgage, the yearly payments would amount to $38.4 million to provide housing to all homeless people and $8.2 billion to provide an affordable unit to every single cost burden renter. And that would represent 0.62% of the Houston city budget to house all homeless people and 132% of Houston's budget. So a pretty wide range here. So going from less than 1% of the city budget to house every single homeless person versus over a third as big as the Houston city budget and a third again, to give an affordable unit to every single cost burden renter. But we don't have to give an affordable housing unit to every single cost burden renter. The idea is that as we build enough affordable housing units, it'll place enough downward pressure on private market rent. And in the meantime, while they're still being built and while rents are still decreasing, the city of Houston would be increasing the amount of assets it possesses. So it would then own this land, it would own these buildings, it would have a rental income stream. And what this means is that it would give the city of Houston greater flexibility in providing even more housing. So an initial bond apportionment from the city might be able to grow into a self-sustaining enterprise. And if the program proves successful, even more funds could always be allocated. Now, this would build communal assets, but it would also decrease costs for overburdened households. And as we mentioned above, over a majority of households in Houston are cost burdened by their housing. So one of the big questions is, how do we know if we built enough housing? So one of the ways to take a look at that, and one of the ways to think about that, is in terms of information, right? We need to know how much housing is needed. We need to know if it's cost effective to build housing. So there are actually currently 3.5% of single-family rental homes in Harris County have corporate owned. And the ownership structure of these homes makes it very difficult to find out exactly how much any given corporate landlord owns. A lot of them are single-purpose entities, where a single corporation will hold onto one piece of property. So it makes it very hard to trace who is the ultimate owner of these and how and who is ultimately benefiting from owning all these single family homes. So the first step would be to pass legislation to require the reporting of the beneficial owners of real estate in Houston, but also having greater access to corporate landlords' records would give the city greater knowledge in up-to-date rental prices, sizes, and vacancies. And that would give a neighborhood-level look at the kind of information that we would need in order to know if the market's saturated with affordable housing. So by turning to these corporate landlords and having them open up their books, this would give us greater information to then decrease rental costs for everybody in the city. Now, some might be objecting that such an undertaking by the government or municipal government is too big an undertaking. But there's an incredible example of government-sponsored home building on this exact scale, and it's by the city-state nation of Singapore. So Singapore is a city-state that broke off from Malaysia in Southeast Asia, and in 1960, Singapore created the Housing and Development Board. And the idea was to provide cheap, quality, affordable housing to Singaporeans who are living in slums. And nowadays, the Housing and Development Board has more than 1 million units. And these are quality units now. And it was meant to be provided to the lower middle and upper middle class housing. And now more than 80% of Singaporeans live in one of these apartments, with 90% of those people that live in them owning their very apartment. So this demonstrates the power of locality has to really change the housing situation of its citizens. Now, Singapore isn't without its downsides. Neoliberal trends since the 1990s have reduced some of the affordability. And this is because the government has started encouraging individuals to treat these apartments as assets and wanting to increase their prices. But the problem with this is that it's a zero-sum game. The increasing asset prices of a house necessarily increase the costs for somebody else to then buy that or rent that apartment. So there's this tension between treating housing as an investment, where price appreciation is the main policy goal, and also trying to provide affordable housing to all people. So with that in mind, Singapore provides an excellent example of what's possible while also providing lessons on how to preserve affordability by not chasing after some of these price appreciation strategies. So to sum up, I want to thank you for listening. The main idea is that it's possible to affect meaningful change in making housing more affordable, which is a big cost for people in the United States and in Houston especially, an increasingly large cost. And I hope that we can continue to figure out how to make meaningful change that meaningfully helps people in their everyday life. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.
Kitty.